Another method for moral argumentation is reversing the situation. This method is often an attack method or a criticism method in which one is addressing a position held by somebody else, but there are cases in which it can be used to argue in favor of your own position. Now, the idea behind this is to imagine, or to ask someone else to imagine, what it would be like to be on the receiving end of some action, policy, etc. Essentially saying, how would you feel if someone did that to you? Or how would you like it if that happened to you? And this seems to be based on what is often called the golden rule, which is, of course, whoever has the different golden rule. The classic one is do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And essentially, it's reversing the situation. The idea being that you should only do to other people what you would be willing to receive in turn, to reverse the situation. And so if a person is unwilling to abide by their own principles, rules, etc., when the situation is reversed, then it seems reasonable to question those principles, rules, etc. Now, as a practical matter, this method can be most effective when interacting with the person and being able to actually ask them if they'd be willing to be subject to their own actions, policies, etc. But this is more a matter of persuasion, that is to say, swaying people's, typically their feelings, to get them to accept something, as opposed to a matter of logic. From a logical standpoint, it doesn't matter, but as a practical matter, it can be very useful in this type of context. Now, the foundation of this method is very similar to that of consistent application, another method. And in this role, it's based on the same assumptions. The idea that morality should be consistent. There also should be a principle of equality and a principle of impartiality. And one could also look at it in terms of being founded on the notion of fairness. And there are many different accounts of what is fair. This can be obviously very contentious, but kind of an hopefully somewhat neutral account of fairness is this. It's kind of reasonable to think that something is fair, a rule, policy, procedure, when everyone involved in it would find it acceptable to trade places under similar circumstances, provided they viewed the situation objectively. Obviously, people would not like to be in, say, a situation of being, punished or fined or failing a class. But the idea would be is that it's looked at more objectively. If that, of course, is possible, that could be debated as well. Kind of a silly example of this would be the method of, say, cutting cake. So what, kind of parents and others have hit on over the centuries is the idea that, if there's the children are going to cut the cake and there's two kids, the idea is that, one child cuts the cake and the other child, picks. And the idea would be is that since, the person gets to pick, the cut will be fair, because if the cut is unfair, presumably the other sibling will take the bigger slice. So on to the actual method of reversing the situation. So the method is this, and there are 3 steps. The first step is that an action, policy, rule, etc. is proposed or implemented with at least 2 parties. The agent, imposing it or, developing it, etc., and the target of the action, policy, etc. For example, it could be a case where the person is developing like a law. So the person who proposes a law and the people are going to be affected by the law. Or it could be, example, like a professor in a class where the student whose paper is being graded is the target of that method of grading. So the second step is, hypothetically, the situation is reversed with the agent and the target switching places. So using the example of like a professor and a student, what this would involve would be hypothetically, the professor being in the role of the student, having their paper graded, with the student in the role of the professor grading the paper. The third step is that if the hypothetical switch is not morally acceptable to both parties, when they observe it from hopefully an objective, impartial standpoint, then the action, policy, etc. would be morally questionable. Going back to the example, if I, as a professor, had grading policies that I would not want to be subject to, like if I looked at them from the standpoint of a student and thought, wow, this is terribly unfair, then my standards would be morally questionable. Now, an important thing, of course, to consider here is the importance of sort of like it being objective and impartial, if that's possible. Because, for example, if you have a case where there's a judge in a criminal hearing, the judge obviously is not going to want to trade places with the criminal and be punished. So the idea is not, would you be willing to accept, say a punishment that you didn't deserve? The switch is supposed to be such that if you would look at it in terms of, if I was in that situation, trying to look at it impartially, would this be fair? Not a question of like, would I like that? Because the question would always be no. A less serious example would be grading. Suppose a student says to me, reversing the situation. Would you like to get an F for a class? And obviously I would not want to get an F in a class. So the student might say, aha, you can never assign a graded F to anybody because you wouldn't want that yourself. So the obvious reply would be, look at hopefully as impartially, objectively as possible. I would accept that if I did, say, very badly in a class, say didn't do any work, didn't do my paper, then even though I wouldn't want an F or like an F, I would impartially and objectively deserve that F. So that's an important thing about the switch. It's not a question of would you like that happening, but a question of trying to look at it as impartially as possible. Would this be something that could be accepted? So the template as an argument would look like this. So there'd be two premises, and of course, as always, just one conclusion. So you have one party, could be an individual or group, is targeted by another party, could also be an individual or group, and they're being targeted by an action, principle, or policy in a particular set of circumstances. We could take, to use like a very simple example, that as a professor, my students are subject to the grading policies for the paper. And it has a set of policies like, let's say like a policy for being late. So the final deadline for the paper is like 50%, half credit. The second premise is you would establish or argue that the person, who is targeting, that in this case, me, the professor, would not find that policy, procedure, etc., morally acceptable in those same circumstances. So, someone might say, if you were a student, would you find it morally acceptable for a late paper to get, the latest time it could be turned in for half credit? So if someone could show that I would not, then the conclusion would be this, that my inflicting that 50% grade under those circumstances would not be morally acceptable. So in generic terms, the idea, going to the templatey thing, which is, it's kind of math-like, so people often find it kind of boring, but generically it would be premise 1, party A is targeted by party B for action, principle, policy, etc. P in circumstances C. Premise 2, B would not find being targeted by A for action, principle, policy, etc. P morally acceptable in circumstances C. Therefore, a conclusion, B doing P to A in circumstances C is not morally acceptable. And again, going back to the quick example, if I would not find it acceptable to receive a 50% grade on a paper if I turned it in at the last possible time in a semester with no excuses, then it would be immoral for me to inflict the same standard on students. Now, again, it's important it's not just a matter of like, I wouldn't like it, because obviously I wouldn't like that. No one would like, say, failing or getting a bad grade or being fined, etc. But again, it's a question of trying to look at it objectively, impartially. So it's not a question of would I like or dislike this. It's a question of, given those circumstances, under all those conditions, would this be acceptable? And again, this can be somewhat tough to argue, and people could bring in subjectivity and relativity, but that's the basic idea. So examples, common examples would be things like, we could take the ethics of, say, migration. Someone could say, in the United States, where we have this ongoing forever debate about immigration, legal and otherwise, and someone could, especially arguing, as a persuasive element, arguing to people whose ancestors were immigrants, saying like, how would you like it if you were a person trying to immigrate to a country, if you were treated in this manner, treated in this hostile, derogatory manner, being accused, for example, of being a criminal, being accused of stealing jobs, being accused of bringing disease. And of course, people would not like that. And so you could say, in reversing the situation, that we shouldn't treat people in ways we would find unacceptable ourselves. And again, it's not just a matter of I wouldn't like that. It's a question of, looked at sort of impartially, would it be acceptable for, the people imposing these conditions to be under those conditions? Now, kind of a weak point of this method, of course, is it does seem to require some degree of compassion and understanding, because a person could simply, say, kind of perhaps fanatically, well, if I was in that situation, I should be, punished or kept out of the country. My ancestors, they could say, should have been kept out of this country. But of course, now that the fact they were here, now that I'm here, it's all fine. So that's kind of a weak point of reversing the situation. So some considerations. Now, there are some cases, of course, where you really couldn't have those involved switching places. So it's more hypothetical. In some cases, because, you could imagine, let's take a kind of a somewhat silly case, but imagine a case where you have a person makes this argument involving, say, animals, and a developer wants to, bulldoze a wilderness area, build some new student housing. And of course, the plants and animals that live in that area will be harmed or killed. So they can't actually, outside of obviously, movies and fiction, you wouldn't have like deer and bear and raccoons, operating bulldozers to plow down the developer's house and, kill and scatter their family. But of course, the developer would not want that to happen to them. They would not want their home destroyed and plowed under. So say, a bear or, could build a complex to create housing for squirrels or something. And again, that's kind of silly, but the idea is that, a person would not want to be, unhomed and have their family harmed and killed. And so by reversing the situation, we should not treat animals that way. And the obvious counter would be, of course, for someone to say, well, animals just don't count, which is something people often say about other people, that they want to, say, bulldoze people's houses and build stuff there, and they often take the view that other people don't count. And so reversing the situation could be used there and perhaps rejected. A second thing, which I've been mentioning repeatedly because of its importance, is the impartial observer. Now, because of the problem of bias and the fact that, obviously people would not want harmful things to happen to them. I would not want to fail a class. I would not want to go to jail. I would not want to be fined. I would not want to get a parking ticket. Anything that would harm me, I just wouldn't want. And so it's not a question of just would I want that or like that, because there are many things that I wouldn't want or like that I could still deserve, like bad grades, for example. So we have to imagine this hypothetical impartial observer, an ideal impartial observer. And if from the standpoint of this hypothetical observer, it'd be fair to apply the same action, etc., to the parties if they were switched, then the action, etc., would be morally acceptable. If not, it would be questionable. Now, in some cases, the switch might involve a switch of morally relevant properties as well. In some cases, it might be better to use just a straight up forward appeal to impartiality than reversing the situation. You can get a kind of a similar effect. But it's such a classic method of the golden rule and the question of kind of like how would you feel if that happened to you? Now, suppose someone uses this argument, or you're making the argument and you're doing the paper for the class and want to write a reply to it. So the main method of replying to reversing the situation is this. And this is a good faith principled reply as opposed to just like bad faith unprincipled replies. And so the main good faith, good reasoning reply is to argue that there's a relevant difference between the two parties that justifies the action, even if the agent would be unwilling to switch. To use a somewhat silly example, if you've been wondering why the ants, am I trying to like subliminally get people to think about ants, or perhaps this is a dumb marketing campaign by Disney to get people to watch the Ant-Man movies? Well, no. It's let's take an example of fire ants. So when I first came to Florida, I had not heard of fire ants. I'm from Maine, and we have ants that they just do pretty innocuous stuff. Getting into your food a little bit. I guess it's not so innocuous. They might crawl on you, but they just kind of get like a bit annoying and itchy. But of course, fire ants, if you're not familiar with them, they have these stingers and it hurts a whole bunch. And they're super aggressive. So the first time I encountered them, I was running. I saw some ants like on these plants and didn't know about them and just kind of, ran by them. And they were all over my legs and stung me. And then the first time I was like, okay, that's on me. I disturbed them. I'm to blame. But then later I found that they would come after me just like anywhere. Like I would be several feet from the mound and they just come up and just start attacking me. And so I just started killing them whenever I saw them, killing them, all the time. So what a person might say to me, but think of the fire ants. Would you want to be killed just because you were annoying? And obviously I would not. So one might say I should not be killing these fire ants, being at war with them. However, there is a morally relevant difference, which is in the sense that, again, after my initial kind of accidental encounter with them, they just keep attacking me. So there is a relevant difference. If they would not come out of their mounds to attack me for no good reason, I would leave them alone, as I leave like other ants alone. Things that don't attack me, leave them alone. Things that do attack me, I try to kill them right back. And so that would be a relevant difference between me and the ants. I'm willing to coexist peacefully with them, and they are willing to sting me at every opportunity. So that's the method of reversing the situation. It's a pretty good method, and it does have some weak points in the sense of, again, it does seem to require the getting a kind of working conception of an impartial observer. And it often can require, from the standpoint of being persuasive, which is different from the logic of it, that someone have some empathy, that they're able to, switch places with other people and be willing to accept, that they could be in that position and see it from the other person's perspective, or being on the receiving end of it. And those are all kind of complications for this method. So that takes us to the end of reversal situation, and definitely watch out for fire ants. And they're, of course, worse ants. Surprisingly, they're even ants that attack fire ants. But they're even worse. So have a good rest of the day, and I'll see you in the future.